How many philosophers can you name? Even if academic philosophy is not your cup of tea, you have likely encountered the ancient Greek trio of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Names like Descartes, Hume, Kant, Nietzsche, or more recently Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein might also ring a bell. If you are interested in philosophy more seriously, your list will be considerably longer and hopefully include thinkers from outside of Europe. But now consider this. How many of those on your list are women? If you are not a philosopher yourself, you may know some contemporary thinkers often associated with social and political ideas, such as Hannah Arendt, Simone de Beauvoir, Angela Davis, or Martha Nussbaum. If you are a philosopher, you probably know that the trend of studying and teaching about women philosophers from before the 19th or 20th centuries is both a recent development and still somewhat limited. In this talk, originally given at the Cambridge Festival in March 2025, we will explore why women were erased from the history of philosophy and how we can put them there back again. Hi everyone, my name is Tatiana and I'm a PhD student at the Faculty of Philosophy at Trinity College, University of Cambridge. I work within a field that is not exactly new, but is still very much growing, namely feminist history of philosophy. In the past few decades, there have been many attempts at revising and nuancing the history of philosophy as it is taught here in the West. As I see it, these attempts are channeled into two main tendencies. On the one hand, some Western scholars have endeavored to look beyond the geographical limits imposed by their own cultural background and philosophical education and engage with non-European and non-Anglophone philosophies, such as the philosophical systems of classical India, China, the Middle East, and many, many more, to the extent that even the very notion of Western philosophy is currently being reappraised. On the other hand, others have observed the very noticeable lack or numbers so low that they are statistically insignificant of women from before the 19th and 20th centuries represented in our histories of philosophy, and therefore how they are largely absent from mainstream philosophical discourse, and they began asking about the reasons behind this. In my view, these reasons depend largely on the period and the study, with the common denominator being, of course, gender. More recently, there has also been a significant overlap between these two tendencies, with some scholars exploring the philosophical contributions of pre-contemporary women from outside of Europe and America. A great example of this is the recent publication edited by Mary Ellen Waithe and Therese Booth Dijkman. From a very objective lack of surviving sources in antiquity to the, in my opinion, misclassification of medieval women's writings as solely mystical and thus anti-philosophical, to the outright neglect of early modern and non-European thinkers, the barriers to taking women philosophers seriously and including them in our canon of philosophy have been many. As I hope to show you, they are not, however, insurmountable. Before I do, let me answer some doubts you might have. Why does this matter at all? Why should you be interested in women philosophers if you aren't yet? And isn't the very notion of women philosophers or female philosophers somewhat problematic, as it may essentialize what it means to be a woman or female, by which I refer to the assumption that there is a fixed and universal essence that defines all women and all female experiences. What is more, doesn't such focus appear exclusionary? To begin with, this matters because for centuries the intellectual contributions of women, especially in fields like philosophy, have been underappreciated or even erased. Moreover, I see the work in revising our histories of philosophy as important because it has the potential to change how we teach philosophy for the better by making the curricula both more inclusive and historically accurate. In this way, and this is based on my own experience, it can render the very practice of philosophy as it is done today more welcoming for women. Furthermore, the aim of such work is to explore the philosophical contributions of ancient, medieval, and early modern women, not just their gender identity. Of course, gender is a relevant factor in their various historical and geographical contexts because it did very much influence the extent to which they were able to engage in philosophical inquiry. However, their ideas are the primary focus. Moreover, I do not wish to postulate the existence of a distinctively feminine philosophy, but rather to help fill in the gaps within the history of philosophy by highlighting the contributions of women who played a role in its development but are absent in traditional narratives. Even though I hope that soon enough there won't be a need to classify the word philosopher with a gendered distinction for people to be able to envision non-male philosophers, in the context of my talk, this classification still plays a vital role. It is at once descriptive, that is, it shows how things are by acknowledging the historical reality that women have indeed engaged in philosophical inquiry, and normative, namely it shows how things should be by challenging the biases shaping our historiographies of philosophy and actively putting women's contributions in their rightful place. Finally, focusing solely on female philosophers, especially in the pre-contemporary era, might appear too narrow or exclusionary, but this focus addresses a long-standing underrepresentation in traditional philosophical studies. My aim is thus to provide balance to a field historically dominated by male figures. This focus should not make the study any less intellectually rigorous, but rather enrich our understanding of the field as a whole. After all, philosophy thrives on intellectual diversity. This is something that has been emphasized since the very birth of feminist history of philosophy as a discipline. For instance, in her introduction to the truly groundbreaking A History of Women Philosophers series published in the 1980s, Mary Ellen Waithe posed 3 questions. What is the history of philosophy? Have philosophers failed at that most basic task of philosophy, to question one's basic assumptions, thereby to discover the truth? And might we come to a different understanding of the nature of philosophy itself as a result of an acquaintance with women's thought? Now, I cannot promise to give you full answers to all these questions, as that effort would take the space of an entire bookshelf or rather of a library of its own. However, I do hope that by the end of my talk, you will have a better idea of why these questions matter, what's at stake in re-examining traditional narratives of philosophy, and what are some of the ways in which that can be achieved. I also hope that I can inspire you to rethink your assumptions pertaining not only to who gets to count as a philosopher, but also to what gets to count as philosophy, and thus to see that the history of philosophy is not a fixed story featuring the voices of a very narrow group of people, but one that is still being written. In engaging with these kinds of questions, you will in fact be doing metaphilosophy, namely philosophizing about the nature of philosophy and what makes philosophers philosophers. Now, for the purpose of this talk, the definition of philosophy I will be adopting is the pursuit of wisdom and expression of fundamental beliefs based on the analysis of concepts and values pertaining to the human experience and the structure of reality, done by speculative rather than observational means. Now, before we begin, just a few words about me. My own research within this area encompasses the philosophical ideas present in the writings of medieval women in Europe. In focusing on how women in the European Middle Ages contributed philosophically significant ideas that have been traditionally overlooked, it bridges the gaps between philosophy, medieval studies, history, and theology, which opens the door to further interdisciplinary research. Through this, I wish to challenge the male-dominated narrative of medieval philosophy that came about through the historical assumption that women philosophers were entirely non-existent in the Middle Ages, which, as it indeed turns out, were hardly the period of an absolute intellectual oppression of women. By bringing their ideas into focus, I aim to shift how we understand medieval intellectual history on the one hand, and the role of women in shaping philosophical thought on the other. Although my in-depth knowledge encompasses the European Middle Ages, today I will try to give you a perspective that's wider both chronologically and geographically. Of course, I will not be able to cover every philosopher, every century, and even every region, nor will I be able to tackle the methodological issues surrounding the very structures we employ when delineating between different philosophical schools of thought and periods. Moreover, even in discussing particular figures, I will necessarily have to resort to oversimplifying very complex matters. I hope, however, to give you a sense of the broader patterns and challenges in the history of women's contributions to philosophy, thus providing you with a framework for thinking about them critically, and also to highlight figures that illustrate both the richness of women's thought and the reasons for its historical marginalization. And so let us begin with ancient women philosophers. As I have already signaled, the main challenge to the inclusion of ancient women philosophers into our intellectual canon is, objectively speaking, the most difficult one to overcome. Simply put, it is the sparse historical record and the lack of sources. To give the European context as an example, we do know from ancient sources that there were female Pythagoreans and that some women were admitted to Plato's academy and Epicurus's garden. We have a list of over 200 Pythagoreans, 17 of whom are identified as women. There are also 2 women associated with Plato's academy in Athens, Axiophia of Phleus and Lasvinia of Mantinea. Axiophia is said to have traveled to Athens to become a student of Plato after having read his Republic. Interestingly, according to another source, to gain admittance to Plato's lectures, she had to dress like a man. Lasvinia, on the other hand, is mentioned as a student of Plato's nephew and successor, Because of this, we may venture that she might likewise have been a student of Plato himself. As to Plato, he refers to two other historical women, the much earlier Sappho and his contemporary Aspasia of Miletus, a well-known rhetorician. Furthermore, another woman is explicitly characterized as a philosopher in another of his Socratic dialogues, although whether she was an authentic historical figure is unclear. That, of course, is Diotima of Mantinea, featured in the Symposium as Socrates' teacher and the author of an elaborate speech on the nature of love. As one last example, we also have the names of 9 women who were affiliated with the Epicurean Garden, most of whom were there probably whilst Epicurus was still alive. However, although we know of quite a few names of women associated with different philosophical schools of the time, almost no sources exist that are incontestably attributed to ancient women philosophers. As Caterina Pello and Catherine O'Reilly noted in their recent monograph, which I very much recommend to anyone interested in this subject, apart from the Chinese Confucian writer Ban Zhao, who lived in the 2nd century CE, we only have evidence and writings attributed to the Pythagorean women, usually dated to between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, and even these are very contested. Drawing on these issues, Pello and O'Reilly have distinguished between several source categories. To begin with, there are texts which have been incontestably ascribed to an ancient woman philosopher, such as the work of Ban Zhao. There are also texts of which we know that they were in fact written by historical women, but which are now lost, such as the works of Fiano the Pythagorean, Arethe the Cyrenaic, and the famous Hypatia of Alexandria. Third, there are writings which have been attributed to some women, most notably the Pythagoreans, which comprise 10 letters and 5 treatises, but whose authenticity and dating are contested. Moreover, the voices of some ancient women philosophers have been recorded in works authored indisputably by men. Examples include the Hippocratic, Epicurean, and Neoplatonic women, as well as the early Christian thinker Macrina, the sister of Gregory of Nyssa. Some of these accounts fictionalize women who were authentic historical figures, for instance, Augustine of Hippo's mother Monica, or those who might have been real, for example, Silabha of India. Others depict fictional women, such as Megara in the Stoic tradition, who nevertheless provide some idea about the roles women played in ancient philosophical communities. With regard to the largest corpus of works attributed to ancient women, namely the Pythagorean letters and treatises, one of the reasons for which they have not been traditionally included into philosophical curricula comes down precisely to the contested status of the authorship. They might have been written by the named authors or a group of Neo-Pythagorean women using the names of their predecessors, or perhaps even by men appropriating these names. Ultimately, however, Pello and O'Reilly argue that the issue of their authorship should not eclipse the philosophical engagement with their contents, because even if they were written by men, they might nonetheless express the views of ancient women on philosophical issues, even if only indirectly. Finally, because these texts are at least allegedly written by women for women, and because they usually discuss female virtues, the social and married life of women, childcare, and household management, they have been traditionally perceived as non-philosophical. And so including them in our philosophical curricula, as Pello and O'Reilly write, demands a broadening of what is considered a properly philosophical topic, including rethinking the concerns that emerge in practical ethics in the domestic sphere. If we do this, scholar Rosemary Twomey argues, we can actually view them as being supplementary to other discussions of household economics present in the works of authors whom we undoubtedly see as philosophers, such as Plato's Republic and Laws, Xenophon's Economicus, and Aristotle's Politics. Although the vision of the ideal household these women put forward is a very conservative one, as they emphasize the need for pleasing one's husband through moderation, simplicity, self-restraint, piety, and the like, we can nonetheless read them through the tradition of ancient philosophy when it is understood as grounded in determining how one ought to live, Twomey argues. Importantly, the fact that we might disagree with the traditional values they propose doesn't make them any less philosophical. For example, consider this passage from a letter of the Pythagorean Theano to a woman whose husband has taken a courtesan. For the moral excellence of the wife is not surveillance of her husband, but companionable accommodation. It is in the spirit of accommodation to bear his folly. If he associates with the courtesan with a view towards pleasure, he associates with his wife with a view towards the beneficial. It is beneficial not to compound evils with evils, and not to augment folly with folly. Recognize the fact that he goes to the courtesan in order to be frivolous, but that he abides with you in order to share a common life, that he loves you on the basis of good judgment, but her on the basis of passion. Here, Theano adopts a major theme of Pythagorean philosophy, that of harmony, and appropriates it for the difficulties of the married life. Her argument rests on the premise that it is the woman's responsibility to maintain harmony in a marriage, even if that harmony is jeopardized because of the man's extramarital exploits. Yet acting against this responsibility would only create further imbalance. She also goes on to say that by acting in this way, the woman can prove herself as not only fundamentally virtuous, but also morally superior to both her husband and his courtesan. She continues, "My dear, this is how you must live, not defending yourself against courtesans, but distinguishing yourself from them by your orderly conduct towards your husband, by your careful attention to the house, by the calm way in which you deal with the servants, and by your tender love for your children. You must not be jealous of that woman, for it is good to extend your emulation only to women who are virtuous. Rather, you must make yourself fit for reconciliation. Good character brings regard even from enemies, dear, and esteem is the product of nobility and goodness alone. In this way, it is even possible for the power of a woman to surpass that of a man." The idea of harmony within the marriage is also taken up by the philosopher whom I mentioned earlier, namely the Confucian Ban Zhao, who writes, "The way of husband and wife harmonizes and matches yin and yang. It teaches spiritual beings and manifests the great principle of heaven and earth and the important morals of human relations. Based on this, clearly the husband-wife relation ought not to be taken lightly." In this instance, harmony is achieved not only through adhering to one's responsibility, but also through the larger balance between the macrocosm and the microcosm. Now let's take a look at medieval women philosophers. If the major problem with studying ancient women philosophers is the lack of sources, we have access to many more texts indisputably written by medieval women, of whom we know that they were indeed authentic historical figures. Because of this, I will be referring only to such philosophers whose works have survived to our times and have been attributed to the rightful authors. But there are even more figures belonging to other source categories. My focus will be on the Christian Europe because there are some major problems with the philosophical writings of women of that time and place. But first, I would like to give you a couple examples from outside of Europe. And so, for instance, Murasaki Shikibu, considered to be the first female philosopher of Japan, discussed the nature of love, the structure of reality, as well as the status of women's souls and rights. The Taoist master Cao Wenyi wrote about the concept of inner harmony as a means for regulating one's interaction with both their intellect and the external world. The writings of Akka Mahadevi reflect a denial of caste and gender as morally, spiritually, or intellectually significant, whilst the mystic Aisha al-Bauniya integrated Sufi thought into earlier Islamic philosophy by examining the nature of divine love and the conditions needed for acquiring knowledge. In the Christian European context, however, the vast majority of women philosophers wrote within the mystical paradigm, with many employing the visionary one more specifically. Two notable exceptions are Eloise, known through her correspondence with the mainstream, so to speak, philosopher Peter Abelard, in which she discussed her views on love, marriage, guilt, and responsibility, and Christine de Pizan, who started off as a courtly poet in order to earn her living, and is thus considered to be the first professional female writer, but quickly took up to writing elaborate treatises in which she explored ideas that we now associate with social and political philosophy. By the mystical paradigm, I mean both the central theme of the works written by authors labeled as mystics, namely the unity of the soul with the divine essence, and the distinctive way in which this theme is expressed. As to the former, scholar Christina van Dijk has recently challenged the common view that mysticism pursues an ecstatic, selfless union that excludes intellectual engagement, showing instead how mystical thought varies across historical contexts and often intersects with philosophical theology. I recommend her more recent monograph, A Hidden Wisdom, if you are interested in this. Nonetheless, the stylistic features of mystical works usually set them apart from the mainstream philosophies of the time. Furthermore, they have historically led to them being classified as anti-philosophical. Indeed, the way in which we perceive mystical experience, as well as that which is allegedly created as a result of this experience, is crucial in determining whether medieval women mystics count as philosophers. Historically, this perception has been negative because the majority of medieval women attributed their insights to divine visions rather than their own intellectual effort. Philosophers have tended to dismiss them as irrational and thus outside the realm of philosophy. The premise of such mystical philosophy is that the contemplative insights it conveys stem from a higher reality beyond standard understanding and thus cannot be fully expressed through ordinary language, which of course is the essential tool of philosophy. Because of this, mystics rely on symbolic language and allegory, drawing imagery from scripture, human experience, nature, and contemporary literary traditions. Furthermore, the forms in which they convey their ideas differ from the form of writing available only for the men of their time, that is, the structured disputations of scholastic philosophy written in Latin. Instead, they would convey philosophically significant ideas in the accounts of the alleged visions, which employ a subcategory of the visionary paradigm, as well as in their prose treatises and dialogues, poetry, correspondence, sermons, manuals for contemplation, and even their autobiographies, of which many were written in the vernacular. Although there were also many male mystical writers in the Middle Ages, none of the women could have hoped to be admitted into a cathedral school or university, which were the spaces where most of the mainstream medieval philosophy was done. Given this, we may imagine that perhaps at least some of them had no other choice than to rely on the language and style of mystical writing by adopting it as a rhetorical strategy, because it was the only socially sanctioned way for them to do philosophy. Jane Duran has pointed out that when we consider the activities in which women of that time were allowed to engage, and when we think about the constraints under which they operated, it becomes much easier to see how work that is at root philosophical begins to manifest itself in visions, ecstasies, and other religious experiences. Another scholar, David Kangas, wrote, "Women were not considered qualified by the male church hierarchy to interpret scripture or to engage in any theological speculation. The prerogative to interpret and think claimed by men was not considered threatened, however, if women wrote under the aegis of some personal vision or bodily phantasm. This was the loophole for women authors that, in addition to allowing women to write, cemented the rule that only men were authorized to do theology in a regular or academic way." And so the mystical paradigm produces a paradox. On the one hand, it would allow women to pursue philosophy by granting them the ultimate epistemic authority, channeled through an immediate connection with God. On the other, it would also reinforce their intellectual inferiority. Now, what should we do about it? I would argue that we may adopt a methodological framework of a content-oriented reading of the sources rather than delving into the phenomenology of mystical experience, that is, the cognitive status and veracity of the visions the mystics claim to experience, elaborate and surreal as they may sometimes appear to be. Instead, we could simply focus on the intellectual contents of that which is revealed through a vision. Usually, these contents have an explicitly didactic aim. Although very contemplative and meditative, their works are often much more practical than the theoretical discussions of many of their male counterparts. In fact, these women had a particularly edifying purpose in mind when writing and communicating their works to shape their audience's ethical and spiritual development by instructing them about specific moral principles, thus imparting knowledge that advocates a concrete ethical viewpoint. Not only is that philosophy, but it's also a very specific form of what I'm doing right now, namely public philosophy. Given the importance of this didactic intent, shouldn't we read these texts as proposing ideas associated only with ethics and no other branches of philosophy, such as epistemology, that is the study of knowledge, or metaphysics, namely the study of the nature and structure of reality? I think that indeed their ethical concerns aren't just neutral elements of their philosophical systems, but rather the very sources and objectives of these systems. Nonetheless, they are often inherently bound with epistemological and ontological concerns. For instance, being united with the divine is a metaphysical process that changes one's cognitive state. And it is through this unity that true spiritual fulfillment and harmony can be achieved. In exploring ideas which we now perceive as belonging to specific areas of philosophical inquiry, such as ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics, these thinkers usually approach them as part of a larger, interconnected discourse. It is true that their ethics are usually the most plainly visible in their texts, and that one must sometimes do a lot of searching to find metaphysics and epistemology which are not always expressed as explicitly. Once this task is done, however, we see how rich and nuanced their philosophies actually are. To give an example, Marguerite Porete writes that at the latter stages of its spiritual development, the soul remains in nothingness, for love remains in her. Thus nothing remains of herself which might make her melancholy or charmed. Thought has no more lordship in her. She has lost the use of her senses, not her senses, but the use. For love has carried her from the place where she was, in leaving her senses in ease, and so has ceased their use. This is the completion of her pilgrimage and the annihilation by her rendering of her will, which is dissolved in love. This is the captivity of the high sea, for she leaves without her will, and so she is in being above her deliberation. From this point onward, the soul is no longer tied to its worldly existence by thought, namely rational discursive thinking, or in Poret's words, the active use, rather than the permanent capacity of deliberation. Since the soul is no longer within itself, it has let go of its desires and fears, as well as of the reason which has previously ruled over it. By emphasizing that the soul has lost the use of its senses rather than the senses themselves, Porete may be suggesting that although the soul still possesses sensory and intellectual powers as its essential faculties, it is no longer bound by them epistemically, but has transcended them as instruments of cognition. This is to say that with regard to its ontological essence, the soul still has a will and a rational mind, but through the power of love, it uses its will to decide that it no longer has any need for the use of them and can let go of them. The most extensive scholarship on women philosophers from before the 19th century has focused on the period that is closest to us chronologically, namely on early modern philosophy. There is now quite a lot of studies reappraising the works of women from the period between the 16th and 18th centuries, most notably, however, in Europe. Because such studies are now widely available, I will say the least about the authors they examine. If the major problem with studying ancient women philosophers is the lack of sources, and with medieval women it is the way in which the sources we do have were written, when it comes to early modern women philosophers, we have a very large body of sources indeed, many of which were written in forms and styles that were also employed by their male contemporaries. And so, rather than existing somewhat on the margins of philosophy, which can be said of medieval women, they actively participated in the same philosophical debates as the men of their time. Now, these women composed full-length philosophical treatises, just as male philosophers did, which engaged with metaphysics, ethics, epistemology, and natural philosophy. For instance, in her Principles of the Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy, Anne Conway developed a monist metaphysical system which had a direct influence on Leibniz. Émilie du Châtelet's Foundations of Physics proposed a synthesis of Leibnizian metaphysics with Newtonian physics. Other women wrote shorter essays and pamphlets, which again were also widely used by the male thinkers. In her serious proposal to the ladies, Mary Astle advocated for women's education, and we read a feminist, or at least proto-feminist, response to the French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man in Olympe de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Woman. Some women also used the form of the dialogue, which allowed them to engage in dialectical philosophy. For example, Margaret Cavendish's Poems and Fancies relies on dialogue to discuss such ideas as the nature of atoms and other worlds, whilst her Blazing World explores natural philosophy and the idea of the utopia. It is also one of the earliest examples of science fiction. To give some examples which may be less obvious, the period of early modern philosophy is often characterized as a republic of letters, because many philosophical ideas of the time were developed through a shared intellectual practice conveyed through correspondence, which was very much a non-gendered phenomenon. For instance, in her correspondence with Descartes, Elizabeth of Bohemia challenged his views on the mind-body dualism, whilst Damaris Cadworth Masham discussed reason, morality, and women's education in her letters with John Locke, who later, in fact, came to live together with her and her husband. As one last example, at the end of the 18th century, Maria von Herbert wrote to Immanuel Kant and challenged him about certain aspects of his ethics. Finally, some women incorporated philosophical reflections into their autobiographies. For instance, in her Vita, Teresa de Avila examines the importance of self-knowledge and the requirements which must be met for contemplation, whilst in the response to Sister Philotea, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, notable for her engagement with Aristotelian philosophy and scholasticism, defends women's ability and right to do philosophy. Moreover, because some of these women were actively engaged in dialogue with the men of their time, we actually know that they influenced each other. Here are just 3 examples of this. For instance, Elizabeth of Bohemia's extensive exchange with Descartes led him to clarify his views on embodiment in his final philosophical work, The Passions of the Soul, which he, in fact, dedicated to her. Interestingly, his famous evil deceiver argument might have actually been inspired by the work which he had most probably read, namely Teresa de Avila's Interior Castle. As I've already mentioned, Leibniz was not only influenced by Anne Conway's monistic ideas, but he also explicitly acknowledged her influence on his concept of monadology. Now, with the exception of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who was Mexican, all the women I've discussed so far were from Europe. And so, to give you just a few examples from outside it, on the basis of Neo-Confucian principles, Yunji Dang argued for a shared, that is, non-gendered human nature and intellectual abilities, and thus for women's capacity to become female sages. She's considered the first female philosopher in Korea and a major influence on Gang Jeon-il Dang, who continued her work. On the other side of the word, Nana Asma'u of Nigeria discussed the need for women's education, as based in the egalitarian principles of Islam, especially Sufi mysticism. Just 20 years ago, the reason for not studying these women was the lack of critical editions of their works, which would make them more available for a wider range of scholars and students. Now, however, the state of affairs has very much changed. The editions I'm showing you here are just the tip of the iceberg. There are indeed many, many more. Given all this, it seems that the difficulties involved in studying early modern women philosophers are now overcome, and indeed more and more scholars are not only actively examining their works, but also putting them into the curricula and exposing students to their ideas. Now, this brings us back to the original question. Why do we study so few women philosophers, and how do we change that? Generally speaking, to summarize, the reasons for why we study so few women philosophers are as diverse as these women themselves. In the case of ancient women, it is the overwhelming lack of sources and the uncertain authorship of those we do have, as well as the prejudice that the subjects they discuss are outside the realm of philosophy. To address these concerns, we should simply work with the sources we do have, take them as at least indirect expressions of the philosophical views held by the women they were allegedly written by, and finally be more generous with the definition of philosophy and philosophical topics. In the case of medieval women, the biggest problem is introduced by the way in which the sources we do have were written. Here, however, we can again be methodologically charitable and look beyond the mystical style of their works to focus on the ideas expressed through this style. Although ultimately most of them seem to be fundamentally ethical and thus can be read as forming part of the public practice-oriented philosophies, usually they are nonetheless supported by epistemological and metaphysical claims. Finally, given the sheer amount of works attributed to early modern women and the availability of the critical editions, as well as the fact that they discuss the same subjects as their male contemporaries and even employed the same forms and styles which they did, it's quite hard to determine what's the biggest prejudice against including them in our canon. It might be the lack of awareness, it might be intellectual bias. Both, I think, can be fixed if we take incorporating them into our curricula seriously. After all, discussing the historical biases shaping philosophy's past can inspire us to consider ways of bringing about a more inclusive, nuanced, and simply put, interesting future of the field. Today, we have just scratched the surface of the rich and complex contributions of women philosophers. As you hopefully see now, the history of philosophy is much more diverse than we often assume. If this talk has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to explore further, to read these women's works, and to question the narratives we have inherited. You will find the complete bibliography of all the works I mentioned in the description box below. If you found this talk interesting, feel free to like, share, and comment. And if you'd like to see more of the work being done at Trinity College, University of Cambridge, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Thank you for watching.